The muscle car era. Everyone knows about it, everyone loves it, but what most people don't realize is that it almost never happened, and the car that kicked it all off, it wasn't supposed to exist at all. In fact, it broke every corporate rule in the book and was built on a loophole that GM executives never saw coming. In the early 1960s, Detroit was playing it safe. The Big Three were locked in a self-imposed ban on factory-backed racing, and performance was a dirty word in boardrooms across Michigan. Insurance companies were breathing down everyone's necks, and the whole industry was focused on sensible family transportation. But down in Pontiac's engineering department, a small group of rebels had other ideas. They were about to create the car that would define an entire generation and birth the muscle car era as we know it. They were about to create the GTO. To understand how the GTO came to be, you need to understand where Pontiac was in the early 60s. Just a decade earlier, Pontiac was your grandmother's car brand. They built slow, boring, practical vehicles that had about as much excitement as watching paint dry. But in 1956, a man named Simon Bunky Knudsen took over as general manager, and he had a vision. He wanted to make Pontiac cool, and he wanted to make it fast. Knudsen brought in some of the brightest minds in the industry, including a young engineer named John DeLorean. Yes, that DeLorean, the same guy who would later build the stainless steel time machine. Together with engineers Bill Collins and Russ G., they transformed Pontiac's image through racing success and clever marketing. By the early 60s, Pontiac had shed its old folks reputation and climbed to the number 3 sales position in the country. But then, in January 1963, General Motors dropped the hammer. They issued an edict banning all divisions from factory-sponsored racing, and they implemented a corporate policy that no mid-size car could have an engine larger than 330 cubic inches. This was a massive problem because DeLorean and his team had just developed a lightweight intermediate called the Tempest Lemons, and they knew exactly what it needed. It needed a big engine. According to legend, John DeLorean, Bill Collins, and Russ G. would meet most Saturday mornings at the Milford Proving Grounds for casual gatherings they called what-if sessions. During one of these sessions, they put a prototype 1964 Le Mans on a lift and examined it. Collins casually suggested to DeLorean, "You know, John, it would take about 20 minutes to stick a 389 in here." DeLorean's response was simple: "Let's try it." Since all Pontiac FIV 8 blocks were externally the same size with the same motor mounts, the 389 cubic inch engine from the full-size Bonneville dropped right in. DeLorean put some of GM's top brass behind the wheel of the test mule, and the car was so much fun to drive that he often had difficulty getting it back after loaning it out. But there was still that pesky corporate policy about engine displacement. So DeLorean and his team did what any self-respecting engineers would do when faced with a stupid rule. They found a loophole. GM's policy stated that mid-size cars couldn't have engines larger than 330 cubic inches as standard equipment. But there was nothing written about optional engines. So instead of making the big engine standard, they offered it as an option package. Technically, they weren't breaking the rule. They were just giving customers a choice. It was brilliant, sneaky, and it was about to change everything. The engineers had built this monster, but they needed to call it something. The marketing team at Pontiac's ad agency suggested they name it after the Ferrari 250 GTO. GTO stood for Gran Turismo Omologato, Italian for Grand Touring Homologated, meaning certified for racing. The Pontiac had absolutely nothing to do with Grand Touring or homologation, and it sure as hell wasn't Italian. But it sounded cool, it sounded fast, and most importantly, it sounded exotic. Enzo Ferrari himself was reportedly furious when he heard that some American company had stolen his sacred letters and slapped them on what he probably considered a crude street brawler. The option package was devastating in its simplicity. The 389 cubic inch V8 in base form produced 325 horsepower at 4,800 RPM and 428 foot-pounds of torque. It breathed through a Carter 4-barrel carburetor and featured a 10.75-to-1 compression ratio. But if you wanted more, you could opt for the tri-power setup with 3 Rochester 2-barrel carburetors, bumping power to 340 148 horsepower. The package included heavy-duty suspension, a 3-speed manual or optional 4-speed Muncie, dual exhaust, bucket seats, and a floor-mounted shifter. When the 1964 Pontiac GTO hit showrooms, Pontiac's conservative sales forecast predicted they might sell around 5,000 units. They were dead wrong. By the end of the model year, Pontiac had sold 32,450 GTOs. That's more than 6 times what they predicted. The base price was around $2,850, only about $300 more than a base Tempest. For that small premium, you got a car that could run from 0 to 60 in the mid 6-second range and blast through the quarter mile in the low 15s. The success of the 1964 GTO didn't just save Pontiac's performance image. It created an entirely new market segment. Within a couple of years, every manufacturer in Detroit was scrambling to build their own muscle car, but Pontiac kept improving the formula. For 1965, they made the GTO its own model rather than just an option package, and sales more than doubled to over 75,000 units. In 1966, Pontiac sold 96,946 GTOs, the highest single-year sales in GTO history. The competition was heating up with the Chevelle SS, Oldsmobile 442, and others, but the GTO was still king. By 1967, the 400 cubic inch V8 replaced the 389, bringing even more displacement. Sales reached 81,722 units that year. Then came 1968, and Pontiac dropped an absolute bombshell. The second-generation GTO debuted with styling that can only be described as stunning. Gone were the boxy lines, replaced by swooping, curvaceous bodywork with Coke bottle styling, pronounced fenders, and a pinched waist. Hidden headlights behind vacuum-operated doors gave it a sleek front end, while the rear featured iconic loop bumpers with integrated exhaust tips. This wasn't just a muscle car anymore. This was automotive art. The 400 now came in multiple flavors, with the base version making 350 horsepower, but you could option up to the Ram Air 4, which packed 370 horsepower and would scream to 6,000 RPM. Car and Driver tested one and ran a 13.1 second quarter mile at 110 miles per hour. For a production car in 1969, that was absolutely bonkers. In 1969, Pontiac introduced the Judge variant with Ram Air engines, wild graphics, and a giant rear spoiler. It was loud, obnoxious, and it sold like crazy. By 1970, the GTO reached its absolute performance peak. General Motors removed the displacement limit altogether, and the result was the 455 cubic inch V8. This behemoth made 360 horsepower, but produced a staggering 500 foot-pounds of torque. It wasn't the highest horsepower option, but that torque figure was insane. These 455 GTOs would light up the tires at will and pull like freight trains from any RPM. Sales in 1970 were still respectable at 40,149 units, but the cracks were starting to show. Insurance companies had caught on, and they were charging young buyers astronomical rates. A 20-year-old trying to insure a GTO could expect to pay more for insurance than the car payment itself. The party was ending, and everyone could feel it. Then came 1971, and everything changed. New federal emissions regulations forced manufacturers to detune their engines. Compression ratios dropped to accommodate unleaded gasoline, and horsepower ratings switched from gross to net figures. On paper, it looked like the GTO lost half its power overnight. The 455 was now rated at 335 net horsepower instead of 360 gross. The car was still quick, but it was heavier, slower, and less exciting than before. Sales plummeted to just 10,532 units. 1972 was even worse. The base engine made just 250 horsepower, and even the top 450 HO produced only 300 horses. These were respectable numbers by early 70s standards, but they weren't GTO numbers. Sales dropped to 5,807 cars, making it one of the worst years in GTO history. By 1973, the GTO wasn't even its own model anymore. It had been demoted back to an option package on the Le Mans, full circle to where it started. The styling had become bloated, the performance was mediocre at best, and insurance rates were still sky high. Only 4,806 people bought one, making it the worst-selling GTO of all time. The 1974 GTO was the final nail in the coffin. Based on the compact Ventura, it was a joke compared to the legendary machines that came before. The most powerful engine available was a 200-horsepower 350 V8. For reference, the 1964 GTO made 325 horses from just 389 cubic inches. Now, with 350 cubes, they could barely crack 200. It was embarrassing. Around 7,000 people bought the 74 GTO, and after that, Pontiac mercifully pulled the plug. For 3 decades, the GTO name sat dormant. By the early 2000s, GM decided to resurrect their most famous nameplate. But instead of building an all-new car, they took a shortcut. They rebadged the Holden Monaro from Australia, gave it some Pontiac badges, and called it a GTO. On paper, the 2004 GTO should have been great. It had a 350 horsepower LS1 V8 from the Corvette, independent rear suspension, excellent handling, and a civilized interior. For 2005 and 2006, they upgraded it to the LS2 with 400 horsepower. These were genuinely quick cars that could run low 13s in the quarter-mile bone stock. But there was one massive problem. It didn't look like a GTO. The styling was conservative, understated, and frankly, boring. Where was the aggression? Where was the attitude? Where were the scoops, the bulges, the visual drama that made people's heads snap around? Car magazines praised the driving dynamics but criticized the styling. Potential buyers walked past them in showrooms without a second glance. Sales were disappointing. Pontiac moved around 13,500 units in 2004, 11,590 in 2005, and about 13,000 in 2006 before they killed it again. The GTO name was retired once more, and this time it was probably for good. Just a few years later, Pontiac itself would be discontinued entirely by GM. So what happened? How did the car that created the muscle car era end up as a forgotten footnote? The answer comes down to timing, regulations, and the fact that lightning rarely strikes twice. The original GTO existed in a perfect storm of circumstances. Insurance was cheap, gas was cheap, emissions regulations didn't exist, and young buyers had money to spend. Pontiac took advantage of that window and built something legendary. But when that window closed, the GTO couldn't adapt. But here's the thing. The original GTO's influence can't be overstated. It proved there was a massive market for affordable performance. It showed you didn't need a Corvette or a European sports car to go fast. You could buy a mid-size car, check a few boxes on the option sheet, and leave the showroom with something that could run with anything on the road. Every muscle car that came after owes its existence to the GTO. The Chevelle SS, the Roadrunner, the Super B, the Cobra Jet Mustang, the Hemi Challenger, they all trace their lineage back to that 1964 Tempest with the 389 engine that wasn't supposed to be there. Today, clean examples of first and second generation GTOs command serious money. A numbers-matching 1969 Judge with the Ram Air 4 can easily fetch 6 figures. A rare 1970 Judge Ram Air 4 convertible, of which only 108 were built, sold at auction for $682,000 back in 2010. Even clean driver-quality cars from the golden years are expensive, but they're pieces of automotive history, rolling artifacts from a time when American cars ruled the world. From 1964 to 1974, Pontiac built approximately 514,797 GTOs across all model years and body styles. That number tells the story. It started with 32,450 in that first year, peaked at nearly 97,000 in 1966, and ended with just 7,058 in its final year. It's a rise and fall that mirrors the entire muscle car era itself. The GTO rose from nothing, dominated for nearly a decade, and fell harder than anyone expected, but its legacy lives on in every muscle car built since, every V8-powered performance machine that prioritizes straight-line speed and tire smoke over lap times and fuel economy. It was crude, it was loud, it was obnoxious, and it was absolutely perfect. And while the name might be gone, what it represented, that rebellious spirit, that middle finger to corporate regulations and conventional wisdom, that's never going away. The Pontiac GTO didn't just start the muscle car era, it defined what it meant to be a muscle car in the first place. But that concludes the story of the rise and fall of the Pontiac GTO. Thank you all so much for making it to the end. If you enjoyed learning about the GOAT, please hit that like button and share this with other enthusiasts. Your support makes a massive difference for this channel, and I'm grateful for every single one of you watching. But I'll see you all in the next one, enthusiasts.